In 1971, Philip Zimbardo received $4.5 million in federal funding for what would become the most cited psychology experiment in history. And 50 years later, he admitted the whole thing was fundamentally compromised. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one flawed study shaped criminal justice policy, rewrote psychology textbooks across 40 countries, and changed how millions of people understand human nature, and why almost everything you were taught about it is wrong. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo received $4.5 million in federal funding for what would become the most cited psychology experiment in history. And 50 years later, he admitted the whole thing was fundamentally compromised. Here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. This experiment didn't just win awards and fill textbooks, it was used to justify prison conditions across the United States. Real policies, real people, real consequences, built on a foundation that, by Zimbardo's own eventual admission, was rotten at its core. And later in this video, I'll reveal the specific moment a French journalist played a 50-year-old tape recording and heard Zimbardo's own graduate assistant coaching the guards. Word for word, on tape, something so damning that even Zimbardo couldn't explain it away. Philip Zimbardo was, by all accounts, brilliant. A Stanford professor with a gift for showmanship and a genuine obsession with understanding why ordinary people do terrible things. In the summer of 1971, he recruited 24 male college students, all psychologically screened as stable and healthy, and randomly assigned them roles. Half would be prisoners, half would be guards. The prison was the basement of Stanford's psychology building. They even had real Palo Alto police officers arrive at participants' homes to arrest the prisoners on a Sunday morning. Neighbors watched. Some people genuinely thought real arrests were happening. Here's a detail most people don't know. The study was funded by the US Office of Naval Research, not a university grant. The Navy, because they wanted to understand conflict and discipline in military environments. This wasn't academic curiosity. From day one, there was institutional pressure baked into the design. There was a client. There was an agenda. And that matters enormously, as we'll see, because the people running the experiment weren't neutral observers. They were players with stakes. Within 36 hours, things appeared to unravel. A prisoner had a breakdown. Guards began harassing inmates in the middle of the night to disrupt their sleep. They forced prisoners to do humiliating exercises, denied bathroom privileges, and used psychological tactics that seemed to emerge organically from the power dynamic. Or so the story goes. Zimbardo published his findings and argued something profound. Given the right situational pressures, ordinary psychologically healthy people will transform. Roles create reality. He called it the situationist perspective, the idea that your environment, not your character, determines your behavior. Explosive. It challenged the idea that evil required evil people. It suggested that any of us, placed in the role of guard, might become cruel. Any of us, placed in the role of prisoner, might break. The experiment appeared in psychology textbooks across 40 countries. It was taught in virtually every introductory class on Earth. A Hollywood film starring Ezra Miller came out in 2015. Zimbardo delivered a TED Talk watched by more than 4 million people. He won the American Psychological Foundation's Gold Medal for Lifetime Achievement. He became, in every measurable sense, a celebrity scientist. But here's what nobody talks about. In 2018, a French journalist named Thibault Le Texier published a book that should have ended the Stanford Prison Experiment's reputation permanently. Le Texier had done something almost no one had bothered to do before. He went to the Stanford archives and read the original recordings and transcripts from 1971. What he found was staggering. Guards had not spontaneously become cruel. They had been instructed to be. Specifically, Zimbardo's graduate assistant, David Jaffe, who was also playing the role of prison warden, was caught on tape coaching guards on how to behave. In one recording, Jaffe tells guards to be tough, that it's important for the study that they act a certain way. That's not a small footnote, that's the entire foundation of the experiment's conclusion collapsing in a single sentence. If guards were coached, their behavior wasn't a product of the guard role. It was a product of being instructed by authority figures who happened to also be running the study. And Zimbardo, who cast himself as the prison superintendent, wasn't an objective observer. He was a participant, one with enormous power over everyone in that basement. He had a role too. And he played it. And this is where it gets truly insane. One of the prisoners who had his famous breakdown, prisoner 8612, whose real name is Douglas Corpy, gave an interview to journalist Ben Blum in 2018. And Corpy admitted something extraordinary. His breakdown was, in his own words, fake. He was acting. He wanted out of the study so he could go home and study for his graduate school exams. He screamed and cried and hyperventilated, not because the conditions had broken him, but because he calculated that a dramatic breakdown was the fastest exit strategy. Zimbardo had used Corpy's collapse as central evidence that the prisoner role was psychologically devastating, even for stable individuals. That evidence was theater. And here's the detail that hits hardest. When other prisoners later heard that Corpy had faked his breakdown to escape, several of them said they were angry. Not because he lied, because they wished they'd thought of it first. These weren't broken men. These were students making rational, strategic decisions inside a study they knew was a study. The entire premise that situational role-playing transforms the psyche was being demolished by the very people it claimed to have transformed. But even with all of this exposed, there was a deeper problem, one that goes to the bedrock of what science is supposed to be. Science requires replication. That's the bedrock of the whole enterprise. You run an experiment, document your method, and other researchers reproduce your results. If the results hold, you found something real. If they don't, you found a fluke, a bias, or a fraud. The Stanford Prison Experiment was never successfully replicated. Never, not once in over 50 years. In fact, a 2001 study by British researchers Alex Haslam and Steve Riker, filmed by the BBC, run under similar conditions, produced almost the opposite outcome. Guards didn't default to cruelty. Many refused to abuse their power. Prisoners organized, groups negotiated. The ordinary people inevitably become monsters. Narrative simply didn't emerge when researchers stayed out of the way and let participants behave naturally. Haslam and Riker's conclusion gets almost no attention. Zimbardo's guards became abusive not because of their role, but because they were told that being tough was what the study needed. They were being good participants, following the implicit expectations of an authority figure. That authority figure was Zimbardo himself. He didn't discover human nature, he manufactured it. So if the science was this broken, how did it survive for 50 years? And what did it cost us while it did? This is the part of the story that genuinely makes me uncomfortable, because it's where academic misconduct stops being abstract and becomes human. The Stanford Prison Experiment was directly cited in US Senate testimony about prison conditions. It was used to argue that guard brutality was a product of inevitable situational dynamics, not deliberate policy choices. It gave intellectual cover to a system that needed to explain why prison guards dehumanized inmates. And instead of the answer being systemic failure, training failure, or conscious cruelty, Zimbardo handed policymakers a more comfortable explanation. It's just human nature. Roles do this to us. We can't help it. Here's the insidious thing about that framing. It removes accountability. If guards inevitably become brutal because of their role, then guards aren't responsible for brutality. The situation is, and if the situation is responsible, then enforcing individual accountability becomes philosophically almost beside the point. This experiment became one of the most powerful institutional cover stories in the history of psychology. Philip Zimbardo himself became an expert witness for the defense in the Abu Ghraib prison abuse trials, the 2004 scandal in which US soldiers tortured and sexually humiliated Iraqi detainees. He argued directly that the soldiers were victims of their circumstances. His 2007 book, The Lucifer Effect, was a bestseller. He went on international speaking tours. And this is the second open loop I promised you, because Zimbardo's public reckoning with the flaws of his own work didn't happen until 2019. And what triggered it is not what you'd expect. By 2019, the accumulated weight of criticism had become impossible to dismiss. Letexier's book had been translated and reviewed across Europe. Ben Blum's article, published in Medium, had been shared over 1 million times in 72 hours. The BBC replication study had been circulating in academic circles for nearly 2 decades. And psychology itself was in the middle of what researchers called the replication crisis, a sweeping reckoning with how many famous studies simply could not be reproduced. Priming effects, power poses, ego depletion, study after study that had been taught as established truth was collapsing under scrutiny. The Stanford Prison Experiment sat at the center of that reckoning like a monument waiting to be torn down. Zimbardo's response was widely covered, but most coverage missed the most revealing part. He didn't deny the coaching, he didn't dispute the archive recordings. What he argued was that even if guards were coached, the study still revealed something true about situational power, that the findings were directionally correct, even if the methodology was flawed. Frankly, that's not how science works. You don't keep the conclusion when the evidence generating that conclusion is contaminated. But here's what I find genuinely fascinating about Zimbardo's defense. It might tell us more about human psychology than the experiment itself ever did. Philip Zimbardo built his career on the idea that situations shape behavior, that the role you're given, guard, prisoner, authority figure, subordinate, rewires how you think and act. And when his work was challenged, he behaved in a way that perfectly illustrated a different, arguably more powerful psychological concept: identity protective cognition. When our sense of self is tied to a belief, we don't evaluate evidence about that belief objectively. We become advocates for the belief, not investigators of it. Zimbardo wasn't just defending a study, he was defending 50 years of professional identity. Books, lectures, a TED Talk, an Oscar-tipped documentary in development. The Lucifer Effect, his entire framework for understanding human evil. Admitting the study was fundamentally flawed wasn't an intellectual concession. It was an existential threat. And so he did what research consistently shows most humans do when core beliefs are challenged with evidence. He reframed the challenge, acknowledged minor errors, and protected the central narrative. This isn't a criticism of Zimbardo as a uniquely weak person. That's the thing. He's exhibiting the exact same behavior he accused his guards of exhibiting, conforming to the pressures of his role, his institution, his identity, which, if you have any appreciation for irony, is either beautiful or devastating, depending on your mood. Here's where I want to push back on the pushback. The demolition of the Stanford Prison Experiment does not mean situational forces don't matter. They absolutely do. Decades of well-designed, rigorously replicated research confirms that context shapes behavior in profound ways. The Milgram obedience studies, though also methodologically controversial, have been partially replicated with modern ethical protocols and show consistent patterns. Research on conformity, groupthink, and institutional power is robust and real. The problem isn't the situationist idea. The problem is that Zimbardo took a legitimate insight and wrapped it in a study so contaminated by his own active participation, so dependent on coaching and performance rather than natural emergence, that the specific findings were essentially meaningless as scientific evidence. And then those meaningless findings were sold to the world, and to policymakers, as established truth. Here's a fact almost no one discusses. The American Psychological Association's own ethics review concluded, after the fact, that the study violated multiple ethical guidelines. Participants were not clearly told they could leave freely. When one prisoner asked to speak with a lawyer, because some of them genuinely believed the situation had become real, that request was denied. When a participant appeared to have a genuine psychological crisis, Zimbardo didn't stop the study. He noted it. He kept going. The experiment was only terminated on day 6, after one person visited the basement and was horrified by what she saw. She was the only one of more than 50 outside observers who objected, and her story changes everything. Christina Maslach walked into that basement and saw something everyone else had normalized. Guards in mirrored sunglasses screaming at prisoners, prisoners with paper bags over their heads. The smell, the noise, the systematic degradation of human beings happening inside a university overseen by scientists funded by the federal government. She turned to Zimbardo, the man she loved, one of the most respected psychologists at Stanford, and told him it was wrong. Stop it. Now. Zimbardo has described this moment publicly as one of the most important of his life. He said he was so absorbed in playing the superintendent that he had lost sight of being Philip Zimbardo, the scientist and the human being. Her intervention is fascinating for two reasons. First, it directly contradicts the study's own thesis. The situationist view predicts that everyone embedded in the institution would conform to its logic. Maslach proved that wasn't inevitable. Her outsider perspective, her willingness to challenge Zimbardo's authority, suggests that what protects people in corrupt systems isn't immunity to situational forces. It's moral identity. It's the courage to dissent. Second, and this is the part that genuinely moved me, Maslach went on to become one of the world's leading researchers on burnout. Her Maslach Burnout Inventory, developed in 1981, is now one of the most widely used psychological assessment tools on Earth, used in over 90 countries. She built an entire career around understanding how institutions damage people. And her first real data point was standing in a doorway, looking at what a poorly designed experiment was doing to human beings in a Stanford basement and deciding it had to stop. Why did we believe it so eagerly? Because that question, why an obvious mess of a study became canonical truth for 50 years, tells us something the study itself never could. The Stanford Prison Experiment succeeded as a cultural artifact because it told us a story we wanted to hear. It said, ordinary people become monsters because of situations, not choices. It said, if you were in those circumstances, you might do the same thing. And there's something deeply comforting in that narrative, even though on the surface it sounds disturbing. Because if evil is situational, then it's not a personal moral failure. It's not something you have to confront in yourself. It's just what happens when the context is wrong. Compare that to the harder alternative, that individuals make choices, that those choices reflect something about their character. That institutional evil requires individual human beings choosing to participate in it, and that those individuals bear genuine moral responsibility. That second story demands more of us. It makes complicity uncomfortable in a way that situationism doesn't. It closes the escape hatch. And so when a confident Stanford professor presented a vivid, dramatic story, with real police arrests and real basements and real distress, we accepted it. Not primarily because the science was solid, because the story was satisfying, and that, the way compelling narratives override scientific skepticism, is arguably the most important psychological finding buried inside the wreckage of this study. Philip Zimbardo is now in his 90s. He has not fully retracted the study. He continues to defend its core insights while acknowledging, in carefully measured language, that the methodology had significant limitations. That's the diplomatic version of what the archives actually showed. And here is where I want to be honest about something. This story isn't simply about a bad man who ran a bad study and lied about it. It's more complicated, more human than that. Zimbardo was working in an era when psychology's standards for ethics and replication were dramatically lower than today. The IRB, the Institutional Review Board system that now governs research ethics in the US, was in its absolute infancy in 1971. The American Psychological Association didn't publish its first comprehensive ethics code for research until 1973, 2 years after the experiment ended. Many of the ethical norms we take for granted now simply did not exist. Zimbardo likely believed he was doing real, important science. The coaching, the absorbed role-playing, the decades of defense when challenged, all of that reflects human psychology doing exactly what human psychology does. He's not a villain, he's a case study. And perhaps the most generous reading of the Stanford Prison Experiment is this: the real experiment wasn't what happened to the participants in that basement. The real experiment has been watching what happened to the researcher, to the institution, to the field, and to the culture over 50 years. And the results of that experiment, the one nobody designed but everyone participated in, are actually the most fascinating data of all. We watched a story beat science, we watched identity beat evidence, we watched comfort beat truth. And now, finally, we're watching the correction. Slow, imperfect, incomplete, but real. Here's what the Stanford Prison Experiment actually teaches us. Not what Zimbardo claimed it taught us, but what the whole saga reveals when you look at all of it honestly. First, be skeptical of dramatic studies with dramatic conclusions. The more emotionally satisfying a research finding is, the more carefully you should interrogate it. Science that confirms what we already want to believe doesn't need less scrutiny. It needs more. Second, institutional roles are real and powerful, but they're not deterministic. Christina Maslach walked into a situation engineered to produce conformity and chose differently. Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, the idea that ordinary people commit atrocities through bureaucratic compliance, is a real and documented phenomenon. But it's not inevitable. People do choose. Institutions do create pressure. Both things are simultaneously true. Collapsing one into the other is exactly where Zimbardo's framework went wrong. Third, the replication crisis in psychology is not a reason to distrust science. It's a reason to trust the process of science. The ongoing, self-correcting, sometimes painfully slow mechanism by which wrong ideas get replaced by less wrong ideas. The fact that we now know the Stanford Prison Experiment was flawed is science working, just slower than we'd like. And fourth, this is the one I keep returning to. How many Philip Zimbardos are inside each of us? How many conclusions are we defending, not because the evidence supports them, but because our identity is wrapped around them? How many times have we been the superintendent of our own basement, so absorbed in playing a role that we've lost sight of what's actually true? That question is not comfortable, but it is the only question in the end that the Stanford Prison Experiment was ever really qualified to ask. Phase 1. Synthesis. We started with a $4.5 million study that shaped criminal justice policy, filled textbooks across 40 countries, and gave Philip Zimbardo a global platform for 50 years. We traced exactly how a compromised methodology, a coached result, a faked breakdown, and a culture hungry for comfortable answers turned bad science into canonical truth. The open loops are closed. The damning moment uncovered in the Stanford archives was a tape recording, Zimbardo's own graduate assistant, David Jaffe, telling guards to be tough, on record, in 1971. That's what Letexier found, and what triggered Zimbardo's partial 2019 reckoning wasn't a crisis of conscience. It was the accumulated public weight of critics who had been right for decades. Letexier's book, Bloom's viral article, The Replication Crisis, finally becoming impossible to dismiss. Christina Maslach, standing in that doorway, was the only person in the whole story who behaved the way the situationist theory said she shouldn't. And she's arguably the most important figure in it. Phase 2. Final statement. The most dangerous ideas are not the ones that are obviously wrong. They're the ones that are emotionally true, narratively compelling, and institutionally useful. Because those are the ideas that survive without evidence, get taught to children, shape policy, and change the world before anyone thinks to check. A lie told with enough drama becomes a textbook, and a textbook, over time, becomes reality. Phase 3. Closing. The correction of a bad idea is never as loud as its original broadcast. It doesn't get the TED Talk, or the Hollywood film, or the Senate testimony. It gets a footnote, a retraction, a book that 10,000 people read instead of 10 million. But it matters. Maybe more than the original claim ever did. Because the truth, even when it arrives late, is still the truth. And you now know it.